Students, welcome back to U.S. History. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Boston Massacre. So please find the Boston Massacre 1770 in Canvas. And this is going to be really one of the catalyzing events as the colonies begin to really feel some resentment toward their British colonialists, their British overlords, essentially. And this is one of the events where it really begins to get violent between the colonists and Great Britain as a result of the last few years that we looked at with policies from Great Britain that they began enforcing within the colonies. And so for step one, I want to analyze and discuss these images. And I want to question why it seems Boston is such an important place in colonial America. So to kind of figure out why this might be, with this first image, we see a bunch of ships coming into what looks like a port. So Boston, since it is on the coast, it has a tremendous port economy, which means a lot of tariffs, a lot of imports, a lot of exports, things going in, things going out to pump into their economy. Of course, with mercantilism, with the British Empire, a lot of the money would have been going to Great Britain. But we see the development, even though this is an illustration of the time, we see the development, all of the housing complex, all of the tall buildings we hear, which would not have been very common at the time at all, like tall buildings. Usually most of the buildings would have been very level. And we see a tremendously blooming place for a port economy in the New England region. And we see, if we look up here, it's in small text, but it's important to the picture, a view of part of the town of Boston and New England and British ships of war landing their troops, 1768. So we see this complex relationship forming between Britain and the colonies. After the French and Indian War, of course, Britain became much more attached to the colonies. They felt like the colonies made out pretty good with the arrangements after the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, and it was on Britain to make sure that they were getting the most out of these colonies. And Boston, being one of the biggest areas or one of the biggest economies, was really put under the microscope of Great Britain. And they began placing people there, whether it be quartering them, making sure their duties are coming in or the taxes are coming in that they've placed on certain items, or just overseeing them in general, because this is whenever a lot of resentment is coming toward the British government. In this second image, we see with the caption, British troops entering Boston. So we see kind of from this picture, the large infantry that Britain has at their disposal at this time. Britain, of course, one of the major superpowers over the past few hundred years. So they really have persuasion over large parts of the world. They have a tremendous navy, but they also have a tremendous presence on the land as well, too. And whenever you station troops, you can predict what the reaction might be. People are feeling uneasy. These people who are not normally their neighbors are going to act like their neighbors. And whatever consequences come from that is up to the discretion of those soldiers, usually for the worse, right? So we can kind of see on these colonist faces a bit of unease, a bit of tension as they are facing very ornamental, glamorous British troops with their bands playing drums, right, to let everybody know that they're there. So I want to take a look at this video, and I want to predict and submit 3 ways we think the Boston Massacre, this event in question we're going to be watching, would change the relationship between Britain and the colonists.
In 1763, Great Britain defeated the French and their Native American allies in the French and Indian War. Defending the American colonies was expensive, and to help pay for it, the British started taxing American goods like sugar, paper, and tea. Colonists were frustrated. They couldn't even vote in Parliament, and American patriots protested through petitions, boycotts, and violence. Massachusetts was especially vocal in its dissent. The arrival of British redcoats to keep order in Boston convinced many patriots that oppression was coming.
Think about how the media might have changed from the realization of people coming from Britain to be stationed in Boston. Think about the circulation of media, what was allowed in, what was allowed out, what people could publish, what they couldn't publish, and how people would have changed their actions depending on how they feel, if they felt threatened by this presence. So the people's actions might have changed themselves, how they felt about the British being there.
One evening, an argument between a small redcoat contingent and local patriots escalated into a scuffle. Soon, an angry crowd had gathered.
Lobster scoundrels! No one wants you here. Go back to England.
The dirty dogs put rocks in the snowballs. Amidst the melee, someone yelled fire. No one knew whom.
I can't see. The captain ordered us to fire. Don't fire! Stop your firing!
5 Bostonians were killed.
Think about the ways in which this can splinter a community. People who were previously on the fence about whether or not the colony should be dependent or independent of Great Britain, maybe people have changed sides because of something like this, changing the whole spectrum of the relationship between the British and their colonists.
Killed, including African-American Crispus Attucks, who is sometimes called the first man killed in the American Revolution. The colonists were furious. The British troops were moved out of the city, the soldiers involved were arrested, and engravers like Paul Revere of future fame published lithographs of the bloody massacre. Believing that everyone deserved a fair trial, a local lawyer and future president, John Adams, agreed to defend the soldiers. To everyone's surprise, all the soldiers except 2 were found innocent because they were acting in self-defense. The trial gave John a national reputation, launching him to the Continental Congress, where he would become a founding father and help write the Declaration of Independence. But the people of Massachusetts would not forget the Boston Massacre. In a few years, violence broke out again and set off the American Revolution.
Wonderful. So we see as a direct cause for the American Revolution, certainly one of the catalyzing events for the American Revolution. And also think about the incentives for each side, right? The British government wants to really keep this under control, and an event like this absolutely blows up in terms of what it does to the community, what people hear about it, and the perception of the nature of the relationship between these 2 sides. So a lot of things change as a result of this particular event. Now, there weren't many details about the actual Boston Massacre in that video. It's kind of left open to interpretation, which is actually what I'm going for in this sense. So for step 3, I'd like you to find an assignment called the Boston Massacre Investigation in OneNote. And here's some of the context or the background. In the fall of 1770, British Captain Thomas Preston and 8 of his regulars were tried for the alleged murder of 5 Boston colonials. At the conclusion of the trial, Captain Preston and 6 of the 8 soldiers were acquitted, which means they were let go, with the remaining 2 soldiers found guilty of manslaughter. These 2 men were branded on their right thumbs and released. At the request of the Daughters of the American Revolution, this case has been reopened to determine if justice was served in the case of the Boston Massacre. As a member of the commission selected to review the case, your job is to examine the following documents to decide if the verdicts were fair, and if not, discuss whether the case should be reviewed and history rewritten. And your task yourself, was justice served? So you're going to read through the documents and fill out the chart at the bottom, and you're going to answer the prompt at the bottom of the assignment. So A through F, here we have the documents. I did one as an example, just to show you how you can go through these documents, getting who authored it, what type of document it is, when was it created, who do we think the audience was, a very important question, and who was the aggressor in the incident according to the bias of the source. So to really get you thinking from multiple perspectives, multiple pieces of evidence, and that should really give you a good encapsulation of your own interpretation of these historical events based on how they played out. And ultimately, what you're submitting is your response to step 2, in addition to your OneNote submission from step 3. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful day. Please let me know if you need any help.